Mr. Speaker, when it came out through the news media that the U.S. Veterans Fund only put 20% of the money that they received in donations from individuals and corporations actually towards veterans, and that it was done in uncoordinated ways wherein veterans who thought they were going to be receiving food packages or clothing packages from that charity were unable to receive that. Cole and I think that's a terrible thing, first of all, because it turns people off of actually wanting to give to charities, but secondly, because it's basically lying to the people who thought their money was going to go towards impacting people's lives. Charities take on the obligation to be a conduit to that type of aid, and when they fail to do so in the most effective ways, then they harm the charitable system overall. I'm going to give you 3 arguments, but first of all, a model. I think what we're going to do is measure the impact per dollar of what people claim to do. So for example, if your charity says we're going to expand education inside the developing world, then they would measure the kinds of education impacts that, say, United Nations measures, things like number of textbooks per classroom, number of more teachers hired, etc. You would take that all into amalgamation, but you look at it as a ratio of how much impact that is created for dollars spent. So that means if you are still a large charity where still most of your money goes towards paying salaries, that's fine as long as the kind of impacts that you are accruing along the way actually create more of a ratio towards the number of dollars per impact created. Secondly, this would be measured after a 3-year period from the beginning of that charity, so you have 3 years to get on your feet if you're a new charity. Thirdly, this would be an independent body measuring it funded by the government itself, and it would require all charities to release those statistics to the people openly. Fourthly, this would happen in world liberal democracies in general. And fifthly, people would have to brand their status as a charity or not, so it would not be possible to hide whether or not you're a tax-exempted charity by the government. If there's a clarification.
Sure. How are you going to stop people from distinguishing themselves as niche charities that can't be evaluated by the same metrics? Or if you're going to evaluate them by the same metrics, how are you going to compare very similar things like education for one minority group versus education for another?
Okay, well, depending on what their their motive, their big goal is, we will measure that impact. So if they're saying, we would like to increase the education of Muslim children in Afghanistan, for girls specifically, then the government agency will monitor that particular motive. It depends on what their mandate is, and then they'll measure that impact accordingly. Okay, a couple arguments. First of all, why this makes charities overall better? For 4 reasons. First of all, because now the absolute mandate of the charity in order to keep their charitable exempt status is to increase the efficiency possible. So it's not just about, say, for example, advertising to get more money for your charity, and it's not, for example, employing as many people as possible. And especially this means that the people who are employed by the charity, who are the highest ranked people in that charity, their motive is absolutely towards increasing the impact of that charity. We think once you change those goals in order to keep their charity exempt status, they're going to focus more on creating those impacts. Secondly, it holds the salaries accountable, and it makes these organizations more transparent. We think that one of the current problems under the status quo is actually incredibly difficult to get information about how well these charities are doing, because usually the only people who are measuring whether or not these charities have actually met their goals are through these charities themselves reporting on whether or not they made these goals, or you have to rely upon independent news media to decide to launch an investigation. This is particularly harmful because besides for the larger charities that might attract lots of media attention or information, the local charities that people give a lot of money towards, you might go to the charity at your church, or you might go to a charity inside your community and decide to give a lot of money that way because you know the people there. Those are the exact kind of people who are robbed of that kind of information transparency. We think that when you create more transparency through the system by making those charities report to the government or making the government check in on these charities, you necessarily have more money going towards more efficient places. Thirdly, then charities have to compete less in terms of advertising. One of the big things that charities have to do right now is because there's so many of them, they have to try and attract the most donors. What that means is that if you spend more money on advertising, you're necessarily taking away from the impacts you could otherwise be creating. We don't think it's a problem to necessarily concentrate the number of charities that you have in the world such that there are more charities doing more specific things with more capital. Because what that means is that if you're an individual who says, I am really passionate about education in the developing world, let me look up the charities that the US government has decided can efficiently allocate towards those ideas, then you can donate your money towards that specific cause in as most efficient way possible. As it currently is, if there are many charities competing for that same consumer base, then you necessarily lose a lot to just advertising and getting out your information in general, rather than having the vice versa situation where individuals can look it up. I also think you can concentrate knowledge and operations into bigger organizations, meaning that you get the most efficient allocation. What that means is that instead of having, say, 10 very small organizations who inefficiently are trying to tackle the same thing, you probably concentrate the intelligence and understanding under one umbrella organization that then effectively allocates those people where they need to go. If you have more coordination between more tenets of an organization, then you necessarily are able to accumulate that knowledge faster, deploy people faster, and have more change per dollar. The impacts are that I think people feel more secure giving to charities because they feel the charities are accountable. I think that it is deceitful, and people feel deceived when they realize the money that they're putting towards a good cause actually isn't going to the people they want. And thirdly, just more people are helped overall. Second argument, why this makes provision for other people in society overall better. Number one, because if you allocate money towards a charity, now it's going at least to a more efficient organization. It means for every dollar people give, more people are helped. But secondly, even if people then decide to give less to charity, that's actually better overall, because usually when people give to charity, then they go to the government when it comes to filing taxes and say, well, I get tax exempt status for particular things because I gave this money to charity. The alternative now is the government accrues more money to be able to do things like provide for social services, provide for welfare, build roads, build schools, etc. So even in the binary where people are less giving, then at least the charities are held to a standard where they are as accountable or as efficient as the government might be. So overall, we get more people helped per dollar. Thirdly, I also think more money then comes to concentrated hands, which means you get more long-term projects. One of the problems with having very small charities is they can't plan for the long term. They can't make things like, oh, I'll build these roads or these hospitals over the next 10 years, because they don't have that consistent kind of capital. If you have larger organizations that can create more long-term effects, which overall means better projects in the future. And fourthly, I think you get the more concentrated coordination I talked to you about. So the impacts of that are, I think, that because individuals can't access that information, then you necessarily should have the government checking in on that information. Otherwise, you have individuals who feel as though they either can't trust charities as much, or because they don't have or because their niche interest isn't being met, they feel less represented in terms of how much money they can give. But thirdly, I think governments ought to have this obligation, because otherwise they would be receiving that money to be able to help people on their own effective terms. We should at least hold people to the standards of the government.
Yeah, when you're ready.
Ready? Let's make one thing clear from the start, Mr. Speaker. This round is not about charities in their worst possible cases. It is not about the charities that are completely ineffective, the ones that function functionally as slush funds, etc. The reason is because you can achieve fixes in the ways that those charities work without what this motion sets out to do. You can have, for example, an independent regulatory body that the government works with, that these charities have to pass before they get approval as charities in the first place. You can make them force themselves to be more transparent, to identify exactly what plan they have for spending their money, where that money is going to go, and you can make them track their money if they're going to get charitable status in the first place. All of those things can be done without taking out the charities that have impacts that are of lower social value, because a lot of the time charities focus on niche areas, people that otherwise wouldn't get any help, people that only a few people are interested in. These individuals are the ones that no longer get any support in the world of government, and that's an area of impact completely unaddressed by their side that we think is huge on side opposition. I'm going to talk to you about three things in constructive. Basically, why the diversity of charities is good. First, how we reach more people that otherwise don't get help. Second, how we increase the salience of a lot of different important world problems. Third, and finally, how we have more people involved in charities and more effective charities in the long term. My partner, Andrew, will then identify why people have a right to give money to these different charities, and why people who would get money from these charities have a right to receive that money in the most government-subsidized way possible. Not now, Colin. First, let's talk a little bit about what we heard from opening government. We heard this model that we're going to assess things based on more impact per dollar. And I actually think that the way that Sarah tried to deal with the POI was very, very shifty. The POI asked, how do you address differences in value between very similar things, i.e. giving money to one minority group's education versus another? Her response was, we measure it based on the intention of the charity that's giving money. But that seems to defeat the whole point of the regulatory mechanism in the first place. Now there's a huge perverse incentive for these big charities to change their motives and change the way they express their motives to the government, to make make like the effect of the dollars that they're using in their charity seem more effective, right? And if anything, like we hear all this stuff about how they spend a lot of money in advertisement, we think now they're going to be spending more money figuring out how do we make the impact of our dollars seem bigger? How do we make it so that whatever system and standard of value the government is using makes our charity appear more effective, which means that the charities that are using money on advertisement and bad stuff will just shift that money over to the mechanisms they provide without any kind of meaningful change. And the better question is, how do you measure what is meaningful societal value? What does that even mean? We don't hear an articulation from opening government. They seem to assume this like nebulous utilitarian, we're going to try to like give education to people. But we don't really know in opposition what is the best kind of social value and what gives the government the right to choose that this is the value that we should approve. And as a consequence, we think they're going to lose out on a huge amount of important stuff. They say that right now a lot of people are going to be spending money on advertisements, getting more people involved in charities instead of actually using that money for good purposes. I don't know why. They don't give a reason for why. They just assert there's bad charities out there. We're going to say most charities actually do try to go out and help people in the most effective way possible, because why would you work in a charity if you weren't really committed to the goal of helping other people instead of getting money from iBanking or whatever, doing something else involved that gives you more self-profit, which means we think the motives are more consistent with actually helping people in the first place. Moreover, we already told you they're just going to shift money over into being more consistent with the government standards, so there's no efficacy when it comes to these big bad charities, but the small charities now lose out and they don't get help out to the people that really, really need it. They say that and finally, they say that there is a problem with coordination and that small charities aren't actually being as effective as they could be otherwise. We think that, yes, perhaps there is less coordination and manpower in small charities, but those charities also have a huge unique source of knowledge they acquire by virtue of working in specified areas, by virtue of working with specified problems. That knowledge only comes from those small charities, and that knowledge is instrumental to being able to solve those problems in the long term. I'll take back half.
Okay, so yeah, that's disorienting. Susan G. Komen Foundation spends 60% of its revenues on administrative tasks, such as promoting awareness of breast cancer, even though its contributors usually think they're actually solving breast cancer. Shouldn't people like this be protected against that?
So, first of all, that doesn't speak to which one of those things has more of a social impact. That speaks to what, like, the charity is doing with respect to what it's telling its investors what it's doing. Maybe we should make charities be more consistent with what they tell their investors and the people that donate to them what they're doing. That's nothing to do with which one of those goals is more social value. If anything, it highlights the problem, because both of those things are meaningful, and in your world, probably only one will exist. Let's talk about constructive. First, how we're going to reach people who otherwise don't get help. And let me start out here by saying that we are fully comfortable with the government endorsing charities that it thinks have a more effective societal impact over others, i.e. endorsing charities for education impacts as opposed to more minor impacts like spreading some kind of cultural value in an area. We're fine with that. What we're not fine with is getting rid of these charities in the first place. So what are charities? We are going to tell you they're an expression of unique altruism by individuals, that people have different connections and desires to different worlds, to different areas, to different important issues, and as a consequence, when they feel like they want to help those places out, they go into charities because charities offer them a mechanism to help those groups out. Many issues don't have meaningful representation in the world, right? A lot of issues deal with only a few people in very small countries. People in those countries may not be able to get out and, like, for example, go to a university or go to an area where they're going to have a lot of salience, which means there's very, very low chance that some places where really bad stuff is going on will actually get representation in charities and in people that want to help them. These people only get help via small charities and charities that don't necessarily focus on macro issues. What are the consequences? I want you to think about two. First, it means that technically these have less societal value than mega charities that do like education for a huge minority group, but they're more important, for example, than the marginal loss you have of a little less education being given to everyone, because these people literally get no help otherwise, and if they do get some help, they're losing out on a lot of really, really important help. Moreover, in the long term, these become higher value impact areas, right? Because these areas oftentimes, if they're bad right now, get worse later on, with losses of infrastructure, with losses of their ability to breach out into the world and pursue the same opportunities as other people, so they become bad areas of impact in the long term, which speaks to the broader problem of it is really difficult for us to determine what has broader societal impact in the first place. We think that the government has an obligation to err on the side of letting people donate to charities if those charities have reasonable causes attached to them, as per the stuff that we've already talked about. Second, we increase the salience of world problems. We've already told you a lot of problems are localized and they don't get out and people don't find out about these problems. The few people that do get out are the people that spread awareness about these issues to the broader population, right? And this is because charities are the only mechanism that gives them an incentive and a framework to go out and learn about those areas and then actually help those areas out. Which means that in our world, more people learn about bad areas of impact, bad societal problems, which means the chances of those problems being solved are bigger in the long term. Moreover, the government learns more about them, especially if we have regulatory requirements for charities, because now the government gets information about where this money is going, and as a consequence, the people that have the power to change the way things work have a better ability to do so. And in the long term, we have more people involved in charities, more expertise in how to deal with specific problems, and really a better world. That's it, fellas.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his speech. I'd now like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for his side.
Is it on the first of this one?
Second.
I'm in frame.
You're in frame.
Good. Gotta make sure.
It's really important to see your pretty face.
Are we good? Everyone's good to go. Thank you ever so kindly, Mr. Speaker. I think the very obvious problem that we get coming out of first opposition in this debate is that they are willing to conflate the assistance of minority groups with something that has low societal value. We think that that possesses a lot of societal value and has societal impact. What they failed to engage with in this debate is the model that Sarah provided you at first, which stipulates that charities actually have to demonstrate that they are fulfilling the mandate that they set out. The only real response that we get is, well, this is perverse because it means that charities will skew their mandates such that their money can actually be demonstrated to have impact. If anything, Mr. Speaker, that is a good thing because now charities are being far more honest about what their mandate is. They are being significantly more transparent and actually demonstrating that they can fulfill their mandate in the first place. We think that that's something that's incredibly good in this debate today and something that we are proud to stand by. I want to do two things in this speech. First, I want to refute everything that we get coming out of the first speaker of side opposition, and then I want to reconstruct a lot of Sarah's material, much of which I would note just went completely untouched. I think we really lacked a positive stance from the first opposition team in the debate thus far. So the first thing that we get on their side of the house is the notion that you cannot actually determine these things based on metrics and that niche groups are jettisoned. I've already told you that niche projects possess social value A, but second, I find it very odd when they propose all of these countermeasures that you can use to look at the efficacy of charities, but then just assert that there's no way that the government can actually employ them on our side either. At the point at which you're talking about independent regulatory bodies, presumably the methods that they apply in that context could also be used by the government to determine the efficacy of these charities in every single circumstance. But even at the point at which we accept that, we think that there are lots of ways in which these things can be measured. So if there is a charity that is designed specifically with the intent of ensuring that Muslim women in Afghanistan receive more access to education, there are metrics that can be used to analyze whether or not you have actually achieved that goal. So if your goal is to increase enrollment by 30%, you can just look at whether or not that was actually the case. It's not actually something that's that difficult. Or if your goal with your charity is to increase the provision of water for people in underdeveloped countries, you can actually look at concrete metrics to determine whether or not charities have been successful in achieving that particular end. We think that that's quite simple and something that they've conceded. Sure. Yeah.
In your world, a significant amount of those types of charities disappear because their impact is much lower of order than the impact of bigger charities that reach out to broader groups of people.
So yes, we agree that those charities disappear, but what we told you within substantive is that they are largely subsumed within larger charities that have the ability to actually address those particular issues in a manner that is more efficacious. We don't think that at the point at which a charity that is devoted to ensuring access to clean water in Malawi disappears, that will never actually be something that's taken up again. We just think that at the point at which people's money isn't actually going to solving that problem, that's actually far worse because you're creating the impression that they're solving an injustice when they're not even coming close to touching it. We think that that's problematic, and we gave you lots of reasons to believe why bigger charities would actually be more effective in solving this issue in the long run. In terms of the substantive stance that we get coming out of first opposition, I find it very odd because they just say, well, donating to charity is an expression of unique altruism. Like, yes, we agree, people should have the altruistic right to donate to charities, but that never responds to Sarah's piece of substantive that shows that people are actually being exploited under the status quo because there is an asymmetry in information that precludes them from donating their money in the most efficacious way possible. So yes, we think that people should have the right to fulfill that altruistic end, but at the point at which they are being exploited and lied to, we think that the government has an obligation to step in. And that isn't something that is ever going to be solved through an independent organization, Mr. Speaker. You need the kind of comprehensive oversight and the kinds of clear mandates that we are advocating for on our side of the House. They need to provide some kind of alternative to actually demonstrate that their mechanisms will be successful. Go ahead.
Can you elucidate what those things are outside of your independent body? Because we actually haven't heard a lot of elaboration on what it means to determine societal value in your world.
Yeah, I think we've actually made that quite clear, that when you have a charitable goal, you actually have to attach that to clear metrics. You cannot just say, we are trying to solve this problem in X country without actually demonstrating that you have done something to solve that problem, i.e. women in schools in Afghanistan, i.e. people having access to clean water, i.e. actually increasing the rate of people who can participate in civil or political society. We think that that's quite clear on our side of the House. So we told you about the asymmetry of information that extends and that it's completely problematic and that individuals are exploited under the status quo. I also think that the bigger problem that we get neglected coming out of first opposition in this debate is the fact that we actually give charities extensive benefits in society under the status quo. The fact that they are tax exempt, that we designate them and confer upon them specific special privileges. At the point at which that is true, Mr. Speaker, that the state is effectively subsidizing your activities, we think that you have a positive obligation to act in the most effective and efficient manner possible. Because note, as Sarah tells you in her speech and we get no response to, the comparative in this instance is if you are not providing that money to a charity, it is very likely that that money will be redistributed by the state. So at the point at which you are giving that money and it is not being used in an efficient manner, you are, as a consequence, depriving people within your own state and society the ability to have the kinds of comprehensive social safety nets that both sides of this debate ostensibly believe are important. So I not only think that the lack of positive stance that we get coming out of these guys is problematic, but they've never actually showed us in any meaningful sense the kind of utilitarian benefits that they will receive by ensuring that this kind of exploitation can continue. Okay, so what does Sarah bring you by way of substantive? I think we provide you a very clear model. The only response we get is that there's a perverse incentive to basically be more transparent and clear. We are completely fine with that occurring at the point at which charities actually stake out what it is that they want to do. She also told you about why this makes charities better. We told you how this actually changes inefficiencies, that you won't be spending all of your money on advertising campaigns. The only response that we get on their side of the House is that it's important in drumming up awareness. That can be true in certain instances, Mr. Speaker, but at the point at which you are not addressing the substantive goals that your charity seeks to actually ameliorate, then we don't think that drumming up support is necessarily that valuable. We also talked to you about how this actually ensures that there is more accountability and transparency in these charities, and that smaller charities in many circumstances can be subsumed by larger ones. The only thing that we get on their side of the House is that individuals within smaller charities have institutional information that they can use to uniquely solve the problem. The point is, they're not solving the problem right now, Mr. Speaker, but even if they do have that institutional information, ostensibly larger charities can hire those individuals as well and employ them to do good. We also told you about why provision is better. We talked to you about how you're more likely to get more long-term projects on our side of the House. No response. We also told you about the asymmetrical nature of this information. Again, no response. We are incredibly proud to propose. Thank you.
So this was supposed to be a round about the social value of charities and controlling that, but instead it's actually a round about policing the metrics that people say they're going to do without regard to how those metrics actually impact social value. We think both of these are incredibly pernicious. We think controlling charities is antithetical to the charity system as a whole, and we're happy to oppose this case on both of those grounds. We want to present to you a framework of what a charity actually is, or what the charity system in Western liberal democracies is, why it exists. It is a framework outside of the free market system where we address problems that do not have directly profitable impacts. There is no short-term profitable impact to giving education to underrepresented minority groups. There is no short-term profitable impact to going and saving the lives of people who would otherwise die from simple diseases like malaria, right? These are kinds of things that the market system cannot directly solve, and the kinds of things that we create charities for. We create a separate system that does not feed taxes into the free market system in order to address these problems more significantly. We are for better charities. We are for more effective charities. We think that's already happening. What we are not for is having the government decide and squelch the rights of people to participate in these kinds of things that exist externally to our economy. I want to talk about 4 things. First, how charities are actually policed. Secondly, what's going to happen to the charities that are being censored. Thirdly, what happens to the charities that are not censored, what that environment looks like. And finally, about why we think charities have a right and the kinds of groups that are going to be damaged by the removal of their charity status. Firstly, how are charities policed in the status quo? We think there's a tremendous amount of social proof to the work that charities do. There isn't a profit motive. It's not like, oh, you guys made $200,000, like, throw you a bone, we're going to donate more to your charity. No, it's like, you actually did socially valuable things, and people in society believe that you did. Sometimes there is an information asymmetry. Sometimes information doesn't get out, but regulatory bodies do already exist. GiveWell, Charity Navigator, these are successful businesses that make a habit of analyzing charities because donations to these charities go up when they can prove that they're solvent in these ways, and go up when they can prove that they're donating to their goals already. It is a new industry. We support government getting involved in this industry as well and monitoring these things. We support, transparency standards and so on and so forth. What we do not support is having the government decide what these standards should be and when these standards are being fulfilled. We think that, yes, regulatory bodies can exist without being horrible, but individuals need to have the agency to decide. Otherwise, you're going to get unfortunate censorship and unfortunate behavior on the part of the charities. Sure, Colin.
Okay, so in status quo, there's charities that are called Help the Kids, or piggyback off of more famous charities like Save the Children, and basically slush like tons of funds in the status quo, even though we have the IRS to overlook them. How is the IRS going to solve this problem?
So we don't think the IRS is just checking to see if they're not committing tax fraud, right? We propose more substantial regulatory bodies, and we think that this problem is essentially an historical, unfortunate reality of charities, but something that's being removed with more access to open information that we see with these companies that are analyzing charities as their mission. Second, what happens to censored charities? And I think that this is a pretty clear resolution in this round, because we're going to see far fewer corporate donations to these charities, right? Because they don't offer a tax benefit, they don't offer the same public cachet. We are going to see far fewer private donations because you get less benefit for your dollar because it's being taken away by the government, and also because your charity doesn't have the social status. It's not even a charity organization, right? It's just this thing that you want to throw away your money to. It doesn't have the same social proof that you otherwise have. That's a big reason why people donate to charities, and it cuts away a lot of money. We think these charities will cease to exist. Opening government tells you they'll be subsumed into larger charities, which will take on their causes and be able to address smaller niche groups or smaller organizations that don't have the efficiency per dollar that a massive charitable organization can afford to have when they operate at such a scale. There's no reason, though, why you would actually have these companies subsumed, or these charities subsumed by larger charities, especially when they present a risk to the bottom line of the larger charities. They jeopardize the cause of the Susan Komen Foundation when they take on smaller cancers that are less efficient to treat, that you can have less people treated, per dollar, and there's no reason why they'd want to risk their own success, especially when they're being monitored so heavily. So we think that these charities are going to cease to exist, and that's a terrifying harm that happens on the government side of the house. I want to move on to talking about the charities that are actually in this, that are to continue to exist after the government plan has been passed. Because I think that they begin to exploit the system in unfortunate ways. I think they begin to change their metrics so they can continue to exist, and they're going to justify it in very plausible ways, right? Look, of course we have to change sort of our stated goal here a little bit so we can continue to exist. It's important that we address the real cause, so on and so forth, right? They say that they're going to be more honest in the way that they do this kind of thing. But I'm not exactly sure why that's going to be the case, because this competitive pressure to prove that you're meeting your metrics is going to get you to hire consultants from McKinsey and so on to make the wealthy charities look like they know what's going on. We think the slush funds that Colin hates, right, are going to continue to exist because you're going to hire people who say well, change your metric like this, define it as this sort of nebulous thing, right, instead of saying, children education, say like textbooks per child, which are like easy to met out. Yeah.
Okay, if you donate to a local charity with the explicit purpose of saying wanting to purify water in Malawi, why shouldn't it be that that organization is duty-bound to uphold exactly that kind of effect instead of just being able to circulate it wherever they want?
So first of all, we think that they should be forced to disclose these kinds of things so that you know what's going on. It's just that their charitable status should not be removed because we think there are many reasons why they would have failed to meet this burden and why the government is a bad actor in deciding that. That's what I want to close on here today, where I talk about why I think we have a right to these kinds of causes. We think, as Ilya told you, people have vastly different belief systems, religious value systems that don't get accounted in this. If souls are saved, is that something that we can account for? Like, how do you measure when a soul has been saved, right? These are very serious things that charities aim at that can't be measured by their standard system unless it really has no teeth at all. We think that there's also a vast difference in how the horizon of your goal could operate. So you could be operating in the Malawi class, right? You might be the best organization delivering water to these groups, but government gets in the way, like local government gets in the way and your project is scuttled, right? Or some drought happens and you don't get as much water as you could because you had to put it in more emergency situations, right? These kinds of things come up, but they don't mean that the charity is less effective, right? They just might mean circumstances related to those metrics have altered. Sometimes those metrics are too large. What if you're trying to change the social perception of a particular racial group, and you're trying to do that over the course of decades, right? How are you supposed to measure that kind of thing, right? Do we just say racial charities shouldn't exist unless they're directly targeting benefits like number of hate crimes per year or something like that? That's very strange to me. I think these charities will cease to exist. We think that also, what if you're trying to put an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? It's probably not going to happen, but it's a good thing to be working toward, right? It's a good thing to raise awareness about and get people talking about. You might not have the same measurable impacts that you think you're able to have. We think in general, right, where there are conflict areas, you're going to see less investment by these charities, right? In a war-torn, civil war-torn country, charities won't be able to go into these places because they're risking the chance of meeting their metrics. Those kinds of areas are going to be underserved. Those kinds of areas are being unfairly squelched, unfairly censored. We think that those organizations exist and the social proof around them, especially in our information age, justifies that they should continue to exist. We don't want to get rid of them on this side of the house.
That's it?
You get a thumbs up.
All right, good for me. All right, we've had two different debates so far. They both interest me, though, so I'm going to engage both of them. Roughly how I saw it on the first half was that first government gave you a model that defined this debate not just between particular kinds of social value, but between social value and social non-value. We think this is a fair model to say that we don't care exactly where the social value emanates from, we just care that it is delivered such that people are not defrauded when they're donating to them. We think that's a fair model. We think that first opposition's case in no way responds to it, and we're going to give one point of extension that engages that model and engages any possible model of this case, and that's going to be about charities that are openly fraudulent and why you can't just take their blithe assertion that the IRS or some other regulatory body can deal with it. However, we're also going to extend this debate in responding to the case that first opposition decided to opt, which is the idea of having different value judgments between particular social values, why we think this is legitimate within a construction of charitable giving. Okay, that's going to be a lot, it's going to be crazy, but it's going to be really awesome. Okay, first point, let's talk about this open defraudulent nature, because Ilya gets up here and he says, those slush funds that Colin refers to, they're things that we can deal with regulation. We don't think so, and here's why. We think that the administrative bloat that occurs within charities, whether or not the charities are at least have good intentions, like we're willing to believe the Susan G. Komen Foundation has good intentions, it's just shitty, it's doing its job, or if it has bad intentions. In fact, it's much like government in terms of its incentive structure, which is to say whether or not it's good or bad, there's always an incentive for the administrative function rather than the value creating for others function to expand itself. Because the people who are defining those budgets themselves are the people who get that administrative contribution. Basically, they get to decide their own salaries. We think that this is not a virtuous cycle, it's quite the opposite. We think the other problem that befalls these charities, again, we're not even getting into whether or not they have good intentions, is an arms race between advertisers in order to accrue money. So we're going to say two things. One, this arms race isn't a good thing, and we're going to say, secondly, that more money net in the charitable universe isn't always a good thing. Okay, let's first talk about the arms race. We say that the arms race of advertising and fundraising is where most of this money goes to. Most of the charities that have 60 or 70% of their funding go towards administrative costs are actually going towards the cost of fundraisers. And what these charities claim is the 30% that remains after this fundraising process is a larger number than a larger percentage if they hadn't hired particular consultant fundraisers. This may be true. However, that dead weight that's going, no thanks, the dead weight that's going to these fundraisers rather than the charitable effort itself are things that are getting tax-exempt status not just when they're used by the charity, but from the people who are donating to the charity. Therefore, this transfer of wealth from people who are what they thought were donating to a charity to these fundraisers is serving no social value whatsoever. Moreover, what we would put to you, and I'll take you, Nick, at the end of this point if you're still interested. Yeah, yes. Okay. Moreover, what we would tell you is this advertising, this fundraising war occurs between charities for money that was going to be donated either way. Most middle-class families have a budget for the amount that they're able to donate in a given year, and we say that that money is donated either way. Most corporations that donate also have a set amount for corporate social responsibility, and therefore these outreach efforts are competitions between them. We say that restricting this and increasing the efficiency as first government would have us do prevents this arms race from going out of control and sucking out of the value of this charitable universe. Nick.
Why don't forced financial disclosure statements solve for all of this?
They don't, for the two, one of the reasons that I already gave, which is the fact that these charities can very reasonably claim that the 30% they have left over after hiring a consultant specialist in fundraising is a larger total amount than the amount that they would have had if it was 70% without the consultants. Basically what we mean to say is their excuse is we get more net money into our charity when we hire these specialists and these advertisers. No thanks. The problem is that's pretty convincing to people, even for the people who are very closely following this effort. We don't think, however, that's most people. We think that a lot of charitable donations take place at the $100 and lower level, where there's people outside of a supermarket asking for a donation. We think that even for charities that are like, say, help the kids rather than save the children, there's lots of easy ways to trick people into donating to these charities. I didn't know that Help the Kids wasn't the famous one and Save the Children was. It's hard to figure this out. Yes, there's like Give Well or whatever that organization is, does exist. It is effective for many people, but not for all people. Therefore, we think that mandatory financial disclosures doesn't solve the arms race. It doesn't solve the fact that that net amount in charities is greater, which I'm going to explain in a second, and it doesn't solve for that last point I made, but Andrew first.
Why is the Susan G. Komen Foundation going to stop advertising if as long as they declare we're going to spend this much on ads, we're going to meet these other metrics, because they should continue to
Because the advertising isn't the social value. That's exactly the purpose of First Government's model, which is why we think it's a fair definition of the model, which is to say that the advertising and awareness of breast cancer, like I think we're all aware that breast cancer exists. That's not the breast cancer foundations. What is the social value is the value that they transfer to the people who are victims of breast cancer and their families and to research on breast cancer. That's why First Government's model is agnostic to the types of social values that you seek, but they say seek social values, don't hire consultants, don't hire fundraisers, don't spend more on advertising. It ends that arms race. That's why Nick's point doesn't hold. The last thing we want to talk about though is we've talked about the fact that we actually think it's legitimate. So by the way, that's what allows for the fraudulence. That's why there's many people who further their own interest and line their own pockets with this is through this capacity. We would say secondly, even if we were to accept the case that First Op thought they were opping, which is the idea that there might be more and less valuable charities on the social level, they give you this really killer example that I think explains intuitively why we shouldn't do that. They say, how do you measure the value of souls saved, of metaphysical salvation? Mr. Speaker, what we would put to you is the government has no job in subsidizing metaphysical salvation. We say that the government ought restrict what it subsidizes, because make no mistake, tax-exempt status and giving people money off their taxes in the forms of tax rebates is a form of subsidy to organizations that further interests that the government would find it illegal to further on their own. We say that when Mormon charities crop up that are interested in giving out education, allow them to retain their tax-exempt status. We say when Mormon charities crop up that send people abroad to proselytize, we say don't subsidize that because it doesn't have the same sorts of social value. Moreover, what we're not interested in is saying that only the very most utile charities get it. We're not saying like this is a Bentham experiment where we're just going to maximize utility. We're saying the very worst charities are the ones that would get knocked off from this list. We're saying the ones that can prove no social value. They didn't give this model. We're saying that if this model had been given, there's plenty of ways to model it in a way that does not fall into that trap. We say that this kind of adjudication allows the government to further their interest, which is the entire reason that they allow charity in the first place, is they recognize that the government is a collective redistribution of social goods and maximization of social goods, and they don't always know what is best. That's why in a pluralistic society, they allow you to opt out of the common tax system and have your own kinds of social benefits defined as you see fit. However, when those social benefits are political, we exempt them. We say hold religions and non-social utilitarian charities to the same account. We think that we've beaten them on both sides of the case, and are looking forward to see how it goes from here.
Sometimes in debate rounds, you try to solve every problem with one solution without realizing how a complex system is better able to account for the issues that are created and addressed by side government. On their side of the debate, they have mentioned and discussed charities that have less social values than others, and why they would promote or oppose these charities less. Very little. Instead, the primary advocacy that they've had is that we should eliminate charities that aren't transparent, that are actually fraudulent, or that do things that they don't see as valuable. At the end of the day, the problem is that these things are easily solved for by existing systems. We require them to have financial donations just like we do for every business. We require them to be audited by the IRS, not just for tax fraud, but if they are fraudulent and saying they are doing one thing and actually doing another, we go after them for that. Similarly, if you make a promise to a donor or agree to use their money in a particular way, they are contractually obligated to follow these disputes. The difference between side government and side opposition is not about charities that aren't transparent or charities that are fraudulent. It's about ones that don't have easily quantifiable goals, or when you make their goals easily quantifiable, you miss something important about these charities. And that's what I want to begin by talking about, my extension, about where the quantification of goals is fundamentally inadequate, why it neglects the most important charities, and ultimately will become a political process that oversimplifies and deters the best forms of charities. Because I think what we've heard from opening opposition in this House is that there are some charities which we can quantify, but it's hard to assess what the social value of these benefits are. We think that, for example, whether you give Bibles to people, whether you give textbooks to people, might be something that is quantifiable, but we can debate the social value. But there are some charities for which you can't even quantify in any meaningful extent exactly what we're discussing. For a research university, which functions to produce academic value that we can see, that we can interpret, and we can learn something from, that we can use to actually produce and evaluate goods. Well, what are you quantifying? Is it the number of papers that they publish on their side of the house? Is it the number of professors that they hire on their side of the house? Because they never demonstrate why these kinds of metrics are actually correlated with the social value that they care about. It isn't the case that the number of textbooks that you give to children in Africa is the metric that you should care about. It's about how much they learn, and you can't make a number out of how much these children learn or access these charities on that particular regard. So we think what they do is they eliminate and reduce the incentive to evaluate and promote charities that have unquantifiable goals. Things like research universities, things like advocacy campaigns. For example, for programs like making sure that we have disability accessible rooms, which I think everyone in this room would have appreciated by this point in time. At the end of the debate, I think what they failed to do is realize how many of these goods are unquantifiable, and my attempts to quantify them are really problematic. I'll take opening.
Yeah, but you can measure that by the amount of rooms that you have actually made accessible, right?
All right, great. This leads exactly into my second argument. Why using this kind of metric is actively bad. Because you're right, you can oversimplify everything. You could say that whether or not this charity succeeded or failed was based on this metric. But we think what it ignores is the fact that reality is overdetermined and things are complex, and it's not so simple as whether or not you have more rooms or less rooms is really the fault of the charity itself. There are many different factors that involve whether or not you are actually promoting or improving education or public water. To give you a real example, when an organization like Water Ecuador tries to promote having access to clean water in Ecuador, whether or not they succeed or fail is not just a result of whether or not they're using money efficiently, but whether, for example, there are sinkholes that pollute the water supply and make it much more difficult for them to do this. That doesn't mean their charity is worse or that their goals aren't achieved or that there's something wrong with an organization like Water Ecuador or Water Malawi, the example that they rely on. What instead it just means is that things are complicated and it's not so simple as whether or not your number goes up or down. It means that your charity is good or bad or that the government should eliminate you at any extent. And now their response to this, but there are some charities that are so bad that it's obvious exactly that they're not making any good and we should get rid of these ones. But again, this doesn't engage with the complex issue that we're not discussing charities that are actively fraudulent. We're discussing ones that are actually have quantifiable goals that are quite problematic. But additionally, the problem, and I think correctly identified by opening opposition, is that this creates issues with their mandates and that they have an incentive to simplify their mandates. Now, we think that this is an important argument and one that we think is misunderstood by the opening government, by Colin as well. Before I get into that, I'll take a second PO. I'll take closing this time.
Okay, so the second half of our case, which admittedly is a different model, doesn't require a success or an efficiency, but requires a goal that is at least socially utile. Why should a government define as socially valuable proselytization for a particular religion or political viewpoint?
Look, I think if your problem is with a particular kind of charity, that's again a different debate in which we're saying what you should do is eliminate these particular kinds of charities. It is not a debate about quantification, and it's not the debate that this model set up. But I also just don't think it's a case that the government is some sort of perfect arbiter of value. We think that will become a politicized process, which I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. But we think the additional problem is that essentially by creating simple mandates, rather than creating an incentive to create larger charities that have some sort of efficiency, as opening government tells you, it creates the exact opposite incentive. You want to have small charities with simple mandates, which doesn't necessarily create diversification problems as side opposition has talked about so far, but does create these exact same problems with efficiency. A charity like Oxfam will never be as successful as it broken into its component pieces on government side, because when you have a simple and easy mandate that's easily quantifiable, you will seem more successful than if you have a complex mandate like reducing global poverty that isn't as easily quantified and is again much more the result of arbitrary other factors that your charity is not responsible for. But the next thing I want to talk about, which is why these metrics are problematic, is because of how politicized they will become. Because I think that the argument that Colin gives you is one that appeals to us liberals, but you can easily make the argument in reverse to appeal to conservatives to have serious problems. Why should a charity that promotes the interests or the goals of people who we know are doomed to hell should be promoted in society? Why should we give social sanction or make an organization, like for example, the Gay Straight Alliances, the ability to be a charity on their side? Because when you make these things a political debate, it's not just the case that the liberal view will win out in all circumstances, which is the idealistic view given to you by closing opposition. What instead we think is more likely to happen is that when this process becomes inherently politicized, which wouldn't be the case if you were just making societies and charities transparent, you engage with particular political problems that charities should be able to avoid and shouldn't be susceptible to. Given that, I think this answers just about every question that we have in the debate so far and works through the issues. The only argument that we think has been made so far that isn't addressed by this kind of consideration is one made by the opening government regarding whether or not these charities or having this system will reduce the amount of money that increase the amount of money that the government has, and this being so effective. We think this is based on a few faulty premises. The first is that money that doesn't go to charities magically goes to the government pocket. That's not the way that income tax deductions work or that tax exemptions work. It isn't the case that the money is going to get all the money that would otherwise go to these evil charities on their side of the house. Instead, they get a much smaller sum of the money. But secondly, it's ridiculous to assume that the governments are the ones that are the most effective organizations at providing public goods in these kind of societies, in these kind of circumstances. Like, I know not everyone is as bad as the United States' government, but it's still the case that these governments are not the best people at creating actual value for societies because they're inherently political, because their responses are to the voters and not necessarily to the ways that you would actually create the most social value. This is why, for example, you see our shitty government paying things like $20 for a nail. We think that the problem that they create on their side of the house is creating less efficiency because we think in many ways governments are less efficient as the result of the incentives that have already been discussed and debated in this house. At the end of the day, what side government fails to engage with is the actual cares of the individuals who engage with these charities. Because these are people who are not trying to maximize profits. They're not trying to defraud anyone. And then we think that to assume otherwise and to treat them as individuals who we should be suspicious of is ridiculous. What we should be suspicious of is an attempt to increase the government's tax revenue at the expense of people who we know to be charitable, who we know to be humanitarian, and our society has an obligation to protect.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's important at this debate to talk exactly about what a regulatory mechanism is. We're talking about tax exemption, right? So we're talking about the government not taxing certain organizations. We're not banning them into oblivion. We're not saying, like, there are certain things that create some type of social good, like basic businesses, like Target creates a social good because it allows me to get, like, nice legal pads, but we're still going to tax you because it's not necessarily a social good that the government upholds or the government would do otherwise. That's the standard for social value that Colin gives you that I don't think that there was any type of dispute over. So there are two types of charities that we're trying to target here that we think are bad. Number one, we ban organizations that don't put their money towards goals, like charities that are just incredibly grossly inefficient by their very existence because of structural issues that Colin tells you about where you get no response to, or we're trying to take away anti-social goods that we don't think are goods anyway that the government would not do. These organizations can still exist, but we don't think that they should get tax-exempt status because the government shouldn't be subsidizing things that aren't, like, that the government doesn't want to see happen, right? Ideally, I'd be okay with some people becoming Mormons if they choose to do it. I don't know why we should subsidize those types of charities that are focused on proselytization. Those are the standards for social value that we give you, and those standards weren't really disputed in this particular case. No, thank you. Right? But we're also going to talk about. I'm also going to talk about other certain standards. There are charities that exist to be shells for political causes, so like they can give like endorsements to particular political candidates, or there are shells for corporations that just exist, like clean water charities that can brand certain corporate products for those types of purposes. Charities that wouldn't work under their basic regulatory mechanism of like the IRS because they're not openly fraudulent. They still create some type of benefit, but there's a massive deadweight loss that Colin talked to you about that is structural and endemic to the existence of charities that exist in this way. So like there's nothing that says that you're not like still giving people textbooks when you're putting like 50% of your profits or 50% of the money that you give into advertising that's just competing with other people. So there's no response to this type of arms race problem. So what I'm going to talk about? I'm going to talk about, first thing I'm going to talk about problems with charities and the types of charities that we're targeting that are based upon efficiency. And then I'm going to talk about bad social values, specifically applying the standard that we use of social values that the government would promote otherwise. We think that any other social values should not be given charitable status. That's not to say that they would not exist anymore. We just think that we should probably tackle them. Okay, so what are problems with charity? Yeah, I'll take it before I go on.
Yeah. Neither one of these teams has explained why companies will actually multilaterally decrease the amount they put into ads. If everyone puts 50% of their money into ads, then they can all still have the same relative social value and get subsidization, but the small ones lose out and don't exist. So what's your relative advantage? Can you in any way either quantify it or just make it concrete?
Okay, so the model that we get out of opening government sets a very, very clear regulatory body to talk about the dollar amount of change or active change based upon some type of quantifiable metric for certain charities, right? Obviously, there are some charities with unquantifiable benefits. I think that we can still say that we can still have those charities if those quantifiable benefits are positive social benefits that we would want to happen, right? So in terms of advertising, if your charity spends 80% of its money on advertising, 15% of its money going to administration, and only 5% of its money actually filters down to the cause, obviously it's grossly inefficient, and the IRS can't check for that because it's promoting some type of charitable cause, and they still get tax-exempt status. That's the model that you get out of opening government from the very, very beginning. Maybe there would have been some type of clash if you would engage with that, rather than just complaining that it doesn't happen, right? So number one, Colin tells you that there's a structural incentive for administrative functions rather than some type of productive function. Because charities exist as administrative organizations, they always want to uphold the administrative structure in which they get paid. So their incentive is to put money in administration, and they can point to administration being productive. Look at how efficient our organization is. Look at how many people that we've hired. Look at all of our analysts. We're trying to make the best possible case, but they're not actually achieving any positive social benefit. The IRS doesn't necessarily regulate this. All they really care about is how much they're trying to hide away in terms of their taxes. So there's a difference between ensuring that they don't commit tax fraud or if they're incredibly grossly inefficient and they're just putting money in their own pockets, protecting their pocketbooks. This is the type of thing that we're calling to like. Secondly, in terms of arms race, there are literally arms races between charities to ensure that their administration is the dominant one in particular spheres so that they get the most amount of donations, which is why you see particular charities that, while they might not be openly fraudulent in the legal sense, are fraudulent in terms of defrauding people who think that they're giving money to certain causes, whereas they're not actually giving money to save the children, they're giving money to save the kids, who's piggybacking off certain advertising benefits that Save the Children gives out, and you're actually lying to people indirectly so you wouldn't be able to create some type of class action lawsuit to fix it. So there are the mechanisms that exist in the status quo, or the mechanisms that they provide wouldn't necessarily exist on our side of the house, right? So Colin also tells you that more money in charities isn't necessarily a good thing because of these particular advertising arms races. Because even if they say that on their side of the house a lot more people give money to charities, first of all, there isn't the exact amount of information because financial disclosure isn't the type of charitable donation that we see in a lot of cases. Colin tells you that a lot of the money that goes to these charities are people that are donating $100 online when they see some type of pop-up, or they put money in a bin right outside of a supermarket. They're not going into deep types of investigation, so we need some type of regulatory body to actually challenge the existence of these charities in the first place. Back at
We talk about problems with transparency and accountability. We know another organization that has these problems. They're called governments. Why is it that you believe that governments are so much better than these charities that we know have humanitarian ends?
Okay, right. I'm obviously not going to say that governments are the perfect things ever, but I do think that when governments are acting and giving tax-exempt status, governments should believe that they are good things. So the government isn't going to come out and admit, oh, we don't know how to regulate things, therefore we're just going to give because of the mechanism in this particular case is tax exemption. We're talking about functionally government subsidization. So governments should only subsidize things that they find are productive social goals, right? So if your problem is a critique of the government, we can still think that governments aren't necessarily efficient on our side of the house, but we can fix governments on both sides, and that would mean that we can subsidize better social goals. So what are bad social values, right? So in terms of, we believe that charities only get their tax exempt status in terms of a collective redistribution of goods, something that governments would otherwise do. So we can have a clearly discernible standard for what a social value is that they don't necessarily engage with. Right? So if your social value is a good thing that the government would do, we would not remove your tax exempt status, and we would still try and create some kind of efficiency. But if the social value that you're trying to promote is, like, for example, expanding the scope of a particular religion, or like protecting some type of corporate interest, we don't think that those are necessarily social values that we should support via subsidization or tax exemption. And I don't think the type of charities that we get from closing opposition are the type of charities that are not going to exist. So just because certain things are incredibly complicated and they're incredibly difficult to fix, like clean water in places where there are a bunch of sinkholes, like those are social values that we think are good things because governments would otherwise want people to have clean water. So we're not getting rid of those particular charities on our side of the house just because things are grossly inefficient. So even though things are inefficient, I think that the existence of some charities is unjust in the first place, and we should try our best to get rid of them, or at the very least tax them so that governments can engage in a social project that they think are good things, because social values as defined by the government are generally good.
Mr. Speaker, government really wants this debate to just be about shutting down openly fraudulent charities. Unfortunately, I think that they also have to engage with the actual effects that their policy has on other charities that might be doing some social value. I think it's common for us in the debate to pretend like we have a 100% effective solution on our side of the house. Zach and I are willing to say that, first of all, we do think that there are ways that we can solve for this open fraud that they're talking about that goes on in the status quo. But second, we're okay with weighing the harms of having some fraudulent charities versus all of the benefits we have from having better charities and charities that wouldn't exist on their side of the house because of the terrible model that they set up. So I'm going to do two things. The first thing I want to talk about is the first thing I want to ask is, are incentives changed in a positive way? And the second thing is, do we lose social value with these charities? So let's talk about charities incentives, because that seems to be sort of like the crux of the debate. Are charities incentives going to be changed in a positive way so they become better and more efficient? So we don't think it's the case that metrics are always good. What we think is going to happen on their side of the house is that we think that there are going to be some things that we can't see in the short term that might be better in the long term. So we'll incentivize charities to do more simplistic things that can be more easily measured by metrics. So let me give you an example, because I think there's been a lot of theoretical debate, but it's not been very well grounded in actual examples. So let's say that there's a charity that has a mandate that they want to educate children in Africa. I think that it's actually clear, government says, the metric we'd use is, how many textbooks did they buy? I think that's emblematic of the type of metrics that we think are bad and not very socially utile. So it's like buying textbooks, which is very easily quantifiable, versus something like coming up with a new curriculum that better teaches these kids. I just don't know how it's possible to quantify that, and it's now the last speech in the round, and they still haven't given us any possible way to quantify something like that. You kind of have to do that between four speeches, and I don't think they've been able to do that, which is really bad, because I think that we've shown you, they haven't even contested, they've never argued that these are better, these are going to be that this is going to be have more social value. I don't think that any reasonable person would say that just buying materials has more social value. So I think we've got a more nuanced view for what charities should do. But the second thing is, I think you have to sort of weigh these versus the bad incentives. So we do think that having something like financial disclosure statements where people can see how much they've been spending on advertising year after year, and if the argument that they're using is advertising helps us get more money in the future, that obviously can be solved just through more transparency. It's not like a regulation, it's just more transparency. But here's the other thing. They needed to, this is a weird thing about their model, that they've never actually clearly shown us how these mandates are going to be regulated at all. So if I'm a charity and I still want to keep advertising, why wouldn't I just make my mandate first that I want to get more money into the cause itself, and second, that I want to give more education to kids in Africa. By having that dual mandate, I could still advertise using that justification, because their model was literally they are letting the charities themselves pick their mandates. We heard no discussion of this, which is really bad, because it buys into all of the things that all the problems that they think that they have. But third of all, I'll take back off in just a second, but third of all, I think it's kind of funny when opening government says the reason that the way they're gonna do things better is they're gonna have the government get more money because the government's gonna do more social value. I think it's very clear that Precor was struggling with that POI, like trying to come up like the government, and they're saying, well, the government should think that it's good at things. Well, it can think it's good at things. It might not actually be good at things, and it's a comparative debate, right? It's charities having the money versus the government having the money. You have to do that comparison.
Right. So, Zach, well, first of all, I think we're pretty much just finding the idea of the subsidy and adjudicating it. But either way, we still think that governments are better because they at least have a democratic check and legal repercussions against it that are much more robust than having its charities.
Yeah, democratic checks, not so good, right? Like, charities usually uniquely benefit people who aren't able to engage in the political process to get the government to help them out using social services. Charities are usually charities usually help the people who uniquely are not going to be, or the government is uniquely not going to be incentivized to actually help out. Right? Like, that's why we think that charities are help the people that fall through the cracks. I think that's like the worst response you could give to this argument, right? Because I think the government, that's like what uniquely makes the government bad and inefficient at helping people. So yeah, I think that on the whole, even if you buy that at the end of the day there are a couple of slush funds and there's some fraudulent charities, I just don't think it outweighs all of the harms that we've given you about how charities themselves are going to be less efficient and less good at what they do, and they're not actually going to be able to achieve the good social ends that we want them to achieve. So the second thing, though, that I want to talk about is, like, do we lose social value? Because I think that there are some charities that you literally just can't have measurable, you can't actually have like measurable things to attach to them. So the one that McGill gives you is like research, right? Like, how do you actually quantify research? You need to have some response to this, because I don't think I've ever shown you like what would be a good metric. I'll take opening half.
Okay, some goals are perhaps harder to reach, or maybe even they're more nebulous, like research. But even then, there are different organizations who can impart that research less effectively, who have less outreach. Why not eliminate those charities so that the other ones who fulfill the same mandate but more effectively can then take on more
You
capital?
can't just say there's a magical way to measure it. You needed in one of your 4 speeches to give me some conceivable way to measure it. I just wanted a conceivable suggestion as to how you would measure it, and they failed to do so. So what we're saying is it is literally impossible to measure something like that. At that point in time, that's going to be, you're not going to get that social value. And we think that things like research are particularly valuable, right? Like, these are long-term goals that in the end, after years and years of work, not just the 3-year window, years and years of work, may go on to save thousands of lives. They do have very tangible impacts, just maybe not immediately. Educating people is something. Awareness, right? Like, they try and say that awareness is just not like this good thing. Oftentimes awareness is about socialization. So people who know more about an issue are more likely to treat people who are afflicted by an issue with more respect, like, and are going to be like nicer to them. You can't really quantify that in any metric way, but it has immense social value for people. These are all examples that they needed to deal with. Here's the other thing. Sometimes there are environmental factors. I think opening up talked about this a little bit, but sometimes there are just reasons why charities might not be effective that year, but it wasn't the fault of the charity because they were inefficient. The government's response is, well, we wouldn't get rid of those. Under your model, you would get rid of those. They needed to give you some reason why under their model they wouldn't be getting rid of those. So we think that these are unique, not only because you're losing the social value, but these are often the charities that do uniquely the most social value, the most long-term value that you aren't able to see immediately. I think for all of these reasons, we've shown you why we get better charities on our side of the house, and why on their side of the house, despite the fact there might be some lack of transparency, they're not going to get any more social value through their model. We're very proud to oppose.